Okay, so for part 2 of our stimulants lecture, we're going to start to dig into how cocaine actually affects the body. And basically, there's a lot that we still don't understand about it. It's a very complex mechanism of action, and we definitely know that cocaine blocks the reuptake of 3 important neurotransmitters: dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. So by blocking the reuptake, it increases the presence of those neurotransmitters in the synapse. And if you think about the purposes of those neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, those are ones that we're familiar with hearing about as neurotransmitters associated with sensation of pleasure and energy. So those are, if you can start to think about how those neurotransmitters affect or are related to the effects of the drug, by blocking the reuptake of those neurotransmitters, it increases the sensations associated with those neurotransmitters. But we also know that there are some connections to both GABA and glutamate among the other neurotransmitters. So some things we don't understand, but we'll dig a little bit more into what we do have so far. All right, so when we talk about how cocaine affects the body, it does affect the body differently on different time frames depending on how the cocaine is consumed. So the slowest method is going to be the original one, chewing or sucking on coca leaves. The cocaine is absorbed slowly and the effects are felt slowly and over a longer time frame. And then insufflation or snorting. This is when, of course, the cocaine is inhaled through the nose and absorbed through the nasal mucous membranes. This is more rapid absorption and more rapid onset. Intravenous injection of cocaine is also going to cause rapid effects, and smoking cocaine or consuming crack cocaine is going to also include that rapid onset. So the original form, the least processed form, is the slowest, and then as we move through the other methods of consuming purer cocaine, then we see the onset begin a little more rapidly. So I'm going to show you a quick video about how cocaine actually works in the body.
In the words of music legend Whitney Houston,
"Crack is whack."
But with all the extra attention lately, thanks to Toronto Mayor Rob Ford, what exactly is crack cocaine? Is it really as whack as it's portrayed to be? Crack is simply another form of cocaine which comes from the leaves of a coca plant. After mixing powdered cocaine with a weak base such as baking soda, it changes composition and a solid is produced, often referred to as rocks. This solid has a much lower melting point than cocaine, allowing it to be smoked as opposed to snorted. In fact, it's called crack because of the sound it makes when heated. But why smoke it? Well, the lungs are an extremely quick and effective way of getting something into the bloodstream. Those with asthma, for example, use inhalers to quickly put a drug directly into their system. When smoke meets the large surface area in your lungs, it too slips right through the membrane and heads straight to your brain in as little as 8 seconds. This is much faster and more intense than the effects of snorted cocaine, which generally takes around 10 minutes to reach the brain. However, once in the brain, crack and cocaine are effectively identical. Initially, users feel energized, alert, and much more aware of their senses. In the brain, crack acts on the ventral tegmental area, releasing large amounts of dopamine, the chemical often associated with feelings of pleasure and euphoria. This dopamine travels between brain cells, called neurons, and binds to receptors that trigger the good feelings. Now, normally, this dopamine would be reabsorbed back into the neuron by a dopamine transporter. However, crack alters this process. It attaches to the transporter and blocks the reabsorption, allowing dopamine to build up and continually stimulate the receptors. As a result, you feel, well, really good for about 10 minutes. But soon after, the dopamine levels in the brain plummet, causing an extreme low and often feelings of depression, which is why many users typically smoke more, hoping to reach that high again. Unfortunately, these dopamine levels can take a long time to naturally replenish, contributing to physical and psychological dependence or addiction, as well as increased irritability, restlessness, and paranoia. In some cases, crack or cocaine abuse can lead to something called delusional parasitosis, the feeling that bugs or insects are crawling under the skin. This often leads to self-destructive behavior like scratching or biting in an effort to get rid of the imagined bugs. In the most serious cases, crack's impact on the heart can cause heart attacks, strokes, or even stop the heart altogether, leading to death. Simply put, on the extreme end of things, crack can get pretty whack. Thanks to Audible.com for giving you a free audiobook.
All right, so now that we've got that important issue settled, I do like that video because I think it gives an excellent visual on how cocaine actually affects that neurotransmitter uptake. And it gets into some of the toxicities that we'll discuss a little later in our lecture. But in the meantime, it is consumed typically through the respiratory system. And then we're going to talk about elimination. So cocaine this particular drug is metabolized by enzymes in both blood and the liver, and its half-life is approximately 1 hour. So after about 1 hour of being in your body, about half of the substance will have been metabolized by those enzymes, and that'll continue every hour after that. About half of the remaining substance will be metabolized. The major metabolites, so the byproducts of that metabolism process, they have a half-life of about 8 hours. Since those are around longer, these are the ones that are usually tested for and detected by drug screening, such as urine tests. So a little bit more about the beneficial uses of cocaine. So before it became an illicit drug, before we had this strong cultural stigma about the use of it, it was actually used medically, as we discussed, typically for local anesthesia and primarily for eye surgery and oral surgery. So these applications were the ones where it was primarily used. Since that time period, since the late 19th century, it's been primarily replaced by drugs that are similar, laboratory-created drugs or synthesized drugs with few central nervous system effects. So we do see occasionally around the world some use of cocaine for surgery in the ear, nose, and throat area, but it's not something that we would experience typically here in the United States. And partly that's because of our toxicity concerns. So we'll talk about our two different categories of toxicities, acute and chronic, and we'll start with acute. So acute, the immediate presence, physical presence of the drug in the body. We actually don't see strong evidence that occasional use of small amounts actually is very detrimental to health. So we don't see a lot of acute toxicity with those occasional small doses. Now, when those doses increase, which they tend to do with cocaine users, then we start to see the potential toxicity increase. And basically it's because of that deep and repeated stimulation of the central nervous system. As the video mentioned, this can lead to cardiac arrest. But another really important problem with cocaine toxicity is that it's very rarely pure cocaine that's being consumed. Illicit cocaine is often adulterated, so there are substances added when the cocaine is processed. And those adulterants actually may be far more toxic than the drug itself. So moving on to chronic toxicities, this is when the presence of the drug when the drug is taken repeatedly and in increasingly high doses. And here we start to see some very serious health concerns. We see those mental health side effects, increasing irritability, restlessness, paranoia, and then also paranoid psychosis, that feeling that you're being watched or followed, can be a very disturbing toxic side effect of repeated and high use of cocaine. Now, it doesn't seem to be permanent damage. For most cocaine users, even those who have been using high doses for a long period of time, once they stop, if they're able to stop, they do seem to recover fully once the drug leaves their system. So it's not a long-term side effect. If the cocaine use stops, then the chronic toxicity side effects also seem to stop as well. So among our other concerns about cocaine use, and we'll do this for each of the particular classes of drugs that we go through, is the dependence potential. How likely is it that a user of the drug will become dependent on it? And we do see cocaine dependence in some users. It is a very powerful reinforcer, and they talked about that in the video. You take the drug, you get that almost immediate return on your investment there. You know, you consume the drug, you get that almost immediate effect on your mood, and then powerfully also, when it's removed, you don't just go back to baseline, you go back down below. So that process of making you feel better and then making you feel worse is part of what makes cocaine such a powerful reinforcer. And we do see in lab tests that animals will follow this same process. They'll administer the drug to themselves by pressing a lever, which is one of the ways that we measure a drug's dependence potential. And we also do see withdrawal symptoms. So we talked about a withdrawal symptom being an important component of dependence. And after binge use, we do see that in some people. And this can include irritability, depression, fatigue, increased appetite, and then craving for the drug itself as well. Another thing that we tend to talk about with cocaine, specifically with crack, is its effects on the reproductive system and on human reproduction. This is another area where we saw press coverage of an imagined social trend. So if we think about crack babies, most of us associate that term with a particular image. The long-term effects of crack consumption during pregnancy, covered widely by the media, but it was widely overstated. Of course, this is not something that any physician would recommend, that a pregnant woman consume crack because of the potential effects on the baby. But the extent of those effects and the extent of the whole cultural phenomenon was widely overreported. So what we're seeing in more recent studies is that there really aren't any consistent associations between that prenatal cocaine exposure and developmental measures in the long term. So while it's not recommended, again, we certainly see this effect of the news media on perceptions about cocaine use. And some of the real risks of cocaine use during pregnancy would definitely include increased risk of miscarriage and damage to the placenta. So definitely not recommended, but we do not see the long-term mental side effects that were widely reported during the media's crack baby phase. When we look at where people are getting cocaine, our supply of illicit cocaine, it's available in all major U.S. cities. This is not limited to a particular region of the country. We haven't seen a lot of change in the processing or the price. So the price and the purity have remained stable for about the past decade, and most of the cocaine that comes into the United States comes from South America, Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia. Kind of makes sense if we think about where the cocoa bushes themselves were located. Okay, now let's take a minute to talk about current patterns of use of cocaine here in the United States. We're going to go back to those two important surveys, NSDA and Monitoring the Future for high school students, and we'll see similar patterns there, which again helps to convince us that what we're actually seeing is accurate data, at least on the trends in use. Right now, less than 1% of adults report current use of cocaine as of the 2015 NSDA study, which is the most current one we have. And that's down from peak about 8% in the 1980s. And for high school students, we see less than 3% of high school students reporting current cocaine use, down from 12% at the height of the cocaine use in the 80s. So again, similar decreases over time, even though the numbers themselves might not be completely accurate, we do see this clear trend in both populations, from greater use in the 80s down to minimal use right now. And as we'll talk about as we move on to our lecture on amphetamines in our next segment, this is not unexpected because we are seeing higher rates of amphetamine use in the U.S. Historically, those two trends tend to cycle in opposition, right? So as cocaine use increases, amphetamine decreases. But right now we're seeing an increase in amphetamine use, so it kind of makes sense that cocaine use has decreased. All right, so that will wrap us up for this part of our lecture, and we'll be back to talk about amphetamine use in the next segment.